previous video, we discussed some of the basics of the Socratic method, like what it is and why professors utilize it. In this video, we're going to give you some tips to help you conquer the Socratic method. So our first tip is not always applicable to everyone. So let's just get it out of the way. If you're fortunate enough to be able to schedule when you will be on call in your classes, make sure you schedule these dates wisely. In other words, keep in mind when you have maybe other midterms or exams, or if you have a legal research and writing assignment coming up, you want to make sure that you're picking a date or a class period in which you have plenty of time to adequately prepare for. We often find that if your professor allows you to pick the dates in which you're going to be on call, they're going to have a rather high expectation of how you perform. In other words, if you pick the date and the time that you're on call, they expect that you show up and that you can engage in a conversation with them. So for instance, you want to make sure you actually show up to class that day, and that doesn't happen to be a day that you oversleep or that you skip class. And of course, you want to make sure that it's a day that you've prepared the material. Lastly, if you're picking the day that you're on call, make sure you write it down and that it makes your way into your schedule so that you can, of course, prepare accordingly. I find in my own personal experience that oftentimes your upper level classes will allow you to pick the dates and times that you're on call. But for most 1L classes, they tend to handle the Socratic method in a rather traditional way, and they just randomly call on people. So that's our first tip. If you can schedule the time in which you're on call, do so wisely. Our second Socratic method tip is to relax. I know you're probably doing some sort of internal eye roll. It's much easier said than done. I understand. But the reality is, everyone feels the way you do. So this means that let's say you're randomly called on in class and your professor's asking you questions. Everyone else around you is usually just thinking about the material and hoping that they're not the person to be called on next. They're thinking very little about what you're actually saying in response to the professor. Everyone will ultimately be in your position. So if you can remind yourself about that, take a deep breath and try to relax. Hopefully this can help you calm down and, of course, be able to answer your professor's questions in maybe a little bit more of a confident manner. Something else on this note, see if this works for you. Try to get excited about the idea of getting called on. We understand that being nervous is very, very real. But also being excited is very real. So maybe if you can view the opportunity of being on call as one that is exciting and an opportunity to learn in a very low stakes situation, you might find that you're way less nervous. So if you tell yourself you're excited about the situation, rather than maybe trying to tell yourself to simply calm down or trying to set aside the emotion of nervousness, if again you kind of filter it in a way of being excited or getting excited about the opportunity, you might find that you feel pretty good about this and that it's not so bad after all. Our third tip is to prepare. The best way to feel better about a stressful situation or experience is to be ready to tackle it. So this means do your homework. And we're not saying that you should waste a ton of time by reading or rereading or obsessing over every single word of every single case that your professor assigns. No, we think there are much better ways for you to use your time. But what we do think you should do is to utilize some of the tips and methods that we've provided in class 2. So for instance, we think that you should probably brief your cases to get a good feel for the facts, the procedural posture, and of course the rule and its reasoning that is flowing from your cases. A lot of students also find it helpful to actually book brief rather than fully briefing a case in a traditional way. And again, we discussed that in class 2. Book briefing is basically this idea where instead of taking outside notes, you just use your casebook. Some people just literally write in the margins that the rule is being discussed in a paragraph or that the holding is in a certain place. Some people have a highlighting method. Do whatever works for you. But ultimately with this tip, you can try to combat a little bit of your stress about being on call if you prepare. This way you know that if you're called on, you've done your best to be able to answer your professor's questions. Our fourth tip is if you find yourself on call in class, look at your notes, look at your casebook, look at your computer, whatever you've brought with you or prepared for class. Your professor does not expect that you have all of the answers to their questions memorized or the information about the assigned reading memorized. They understand that you don't. So feel free to look at your casebook. If you're utilizing a book briefing method, look down. Look at your highlighting method. Look at the notes that you took in the margin. If you happen to maybe brief a case in a traditional sense on your computer, feel free to look at your computer screen. If you brought your outline with you where you've taken notes, use that. So feel free to use the material that you've prepared and brought with you to class. Our fifth tip is to pay attention. You'll quickly realize that all of your professors have a very different and unique approach to class and how they're teaching the material. They likely even have a unique approach to the Socratic method generally. So pay attention to the types of questions your professors like to ask. You have a pretty decent advantage if you're being called on after the first day of class. Why? Because if you're paying attention, you can get somewhat of a feel for the types of questions that your professor likes to ask. For instance, do they ask a lot of questions about legal vocab that might be discussed in a case? Or do you find that your law school professor often asks about the holding and then they ask how to apply that holding in different scenarios to everyone else that they call on? If that's the case, keep these types of questions in mind while you're preparing for class. So in other words, if you know your professor doesn't want to talk about the facts of the case, but instead they just want you to apply the rule to a hypothetical set of facts, try to do that while you're preparing for class. Make sure you understand the rule so that if they provide you with a hypothetical set of facts, that you could attempt to apply the law to it. And then lastly, volunteer. You might be thinking that we're nuts, but honestly, some professors give you the opportunity to raise your hand and offer to answer the question being posed. And we often find that students who do this feel much more confident and they quickly realize that being on call is not that bad. This way, if you're volunteering, you can be in a little bit more of control of when you speak. This means if you find yourself very prepared for class one day and you feel pretty good about the material, if your professor is asking a question and seeking volunteers, this is a great time to give yourself that opportunity to speak in class. So volunteer if that opportunity comes about. We also sometimes find that professors take note of those who volunteer and they're less likely to cold call on those people who volunteer. So you might find yourself in a position really knowing the material and volunteering to answer questions, and it might save you from finding yourself on call on the day that you don't feel as confident. Again, every professor is different. There are no absolutes. All in all, though, by volunteering, you're going to find yourself that much more confident. So it can really help boost your confidence and get that experience with the Socratic method in class. So we hope these tips help you prepare for class and, of course, the Socratic method.